So that's the dispute. Is that actually crickets? Because there was at least one report that said, surprise, that actually is crickets.
Yeah, well, they have, scientists who specialize in these species, and they, in a very advanced way, analyze with sonic instruments, very delicate sonic instruments, and determine that is the sound that the female cricket emits during mating season to attract males in order to mate. I mean, it's not like it's similar; it's identical. There's no question.
Just as an aside, they have it so much easier than female humans. It's like the makeup and the hair and the Spanx and the dress and the a cocktail or two. Good Lord, all they have to do, ladies,
just a little
is
screeching, and they come running. Exactly.
Although the truth is, most men would come running if you basically did one key thing as a human too.
Yeah, a little screeching would probably work for human men as well. But no, I mean, so that's what, I found so dubious about this from the start. And now you do have the State Department and the FBI that are increasingly adamant about the fact that they simply don't believe. They're not saying they haven't found evidence. They're saying we disbelieve that these symptoms are the byproduct of some sort of sophisticated weapon. Now you can say, well, maybe it's because
the FBI came out and said initially, they said it's mass hysteria. They initially said this is the result of mass psychogenic illness, which is essentially mass hysteria, like laugh contagion. So if I start laughing hysterically, then you can't help but laugh a little, and so on and so forth. But I think they've softened on it a bit since then.
They have, although even Gina Haspel, who was President Trump's CIA director and a longtime high-level official in the CIA from going back to the War on Terror, and who is not at all known for being dovish. She was a very kind of aggressive hawk during the War on Terror, an advocate of the harsh interrogation programs that most people like me call torture, was very skeptical of the view that the Russian unit inside the CIA had real evidence to pin it on Russia. She actually accused them of trying to gin up hostility toward Russia as part of this overall campaign that had been going on by concocting a narrative for which there was no evidentiary basis. So I don't pretend that we know the answer, but what I know for sure is that the level of certainty presented in a lot of clips we could listen to where Russia was to blame, as they said, were completely baseless. And when you add on to that, Megyn, not just the kind of like low likelihood that they would be able to do this, but also the fact that we have surveillance tentacles in every aspect and every agency within these governments, that they would be able to develop a weapon like this and move it around the world and use it against us without any clue on the part of the U.S. government that they were doing it, seems very, very unconvincing to me.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned earlier this podcast called Unexplainable by Vox, which took a hard look at this, and it was good. And one of the things they pointed out was they had a neurologist. His name is John Stone. He's at Edinburgh. And he was saying, he's a neurology professor, and he was saying, I've got tons of patients who are non-CIA who have this. This is a thing. This is, again, this functional disorder. And he said, when I listen to these descriptions, I think, oh yeah, if you walked into my office as Glenn or Megyn or anybody, I'd say, yeah, I know what you have. It's called a functional disorder. And it happens to non-CIA just as often. So, he cast some water on it, even though he hasn't examined any of the patients. Here is John Stone speaking on that podcast.
I think it is possible a lot of anxiety may be caused about the possibility of having a brain injury from a sonic attack, and that concern is heightening people's vigilance for events that might be consistent with a sonic attack, and then symptoms that might be consistent with a sonic attack.
Right. So now it's like people have been primed to think it could happen to them, and whether they know that or not, it's in there. And so when something happens, you may not even be conscious of the fact that your brain is like, this is it.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, exactly. The human brain is a very powerful instrument. It can actually create real symptoms in the body. I mean, the brain and the body, or the mind and the body, however you conceive of it, are extremely interlinked. And oftentimes what happens mentally in our lives affects us physically, not in imaginary ways, but in very real ways, exactly like he just explained. The other point I think is so worth keeping in mind always is we always like to think that our science and our medicine is very advanced, and obviously relative to what it was 200 years ago, it is, but relative to what it will be 200 years from now, it's extremely primitive. There's all kinds of phenomenon that takes place medically and in the world that we can't explain within the limits of our scientific knowledge. And as you have the world changing so radically with new technologies, new movement, new things happening in the climate, in the weather, in all kinds of cultural and social dynamics, I think it makes sense that there are going to be neurological symptoms that we can't yet fully explain in terms of the origin of, and to simply leap to this like bizarre science fiction story that the Russians had, invented this like dastardly 23rd century weapon is something that appeals to like the science fiction side of us, and more disturbingly for me, fit very well into the geostrategic narrative that was very popular among the CIA and their media allies during the Trump era. But we should demand a lot of evidence for that.
So let me ask you about that. I mean, having studied up on the Russians a fair amount before going over there, I can say they're really, really good at hacking, and they're really, really good at making nuclear weapons. But I didn't see anything about them really, really good at making things like this, which is more in the science field and sort of 22nd century stuff. Who knows? But the media and the reason that you are sort of skeptical, because it really did. This started coming out during the Trump administration. First, there was 2016. That wasn't Trump. 2017 and during his administration, we heard more and more about it. And this is just a sampling of this particular reporter is Ken Delanian on MSNBC talking about the syndrome. Listen to how it's been described by the media.
Intelligence agencies investigating attacks on U.S. diplomats in Cuba and China now strongly suspect that Russia is to blame. Why do they suspect Russia now, and what's the evidence that they have?
Well, it's still partially a mystery, Chris, but they have more and more evidence, they say, 3 U.S. officials tell us, pointing to Russia, including communications intercepts that suggest that the Russian intelligence agency was involved. Now, really, there was only 3 suspects from the beginning here: Russia, China, and the Cubans. One of the technologies used to injure these American spies and diplomats was some kind of microwave weapon that is so sophisticated the Americans don't even fully understand it, and they've been testing some kinds of aspects of this technology.
Your thoughts on him and that?
Well, it's, first of all, when people ask me, what is the ideology of the American media? Obviously, at least now, I may have had a different answer 20 years ago. They're very supportive of the Democratic Party, largely because of their extreme animosity toward Trump. But the overarching loyalty they actually have is to the security state. That's where most of their leaks come from the CIA, the NSA, the FBI. That's where Russiagate came from. And that relationship, which had always been close, became closer even more. The poster boy for that corrupt relationship is Ken Delanian. In 2015, when I was at the Intercept, we FOIA'd to the CIA any communications that they had with journalists, and they couldn't withhold it because it was with people outside the government, and they produced a bunch of emails with journalists. And what Ken Delanian would do, he was at the LA Times at that time when he was covering the CIA, is he would actually submit to them the drafts of the articles he was going to write about the CIA before he would publish it, basically to get their approval. His whole career is based on being a puppet for what the CIA tells him to say. So you see in that clip, he's saying stuff that we now know isn't true. I mean, obviously, Megyn, if the U.S. government, as he claimed, had intelligence intercepts where the Russians were admitting that they had developed a secret weapon, why would Gina Haspel and the entire top level of the U.S. government, both under Trump and now under Biden, be acknowledging that they have no idea where this came from? Obviously, those intercepts didn't exist. The CIA told them they did, and unskeptically, he went and disseminated it all over the country.